I stand before you today in front of two iconic symbols. On the left is the Greek letter phi, representing the Western tradition of thought and action, and on the right, the yin-yang symbol, representing the Eastern tradition. Now, in the West, we have tended always to foreground the self. So in educational psychology, we have many self-constructs, such as self-concept, self-regulation, self-explanation, and so on. But as Greeno and others have reminded us, the self is always in constant interaction with the environment. So I think this is better represented by the yin-yang symbol, where the yang, which I guess is the white part there, if we let that represent the self and the yin, the environment, they are constantly desiring one another in trying to create a dynamic balance. So when I speak of interaction with the environment, I am particularly interested in interaction with the social environment, and which is dominated by student discourse and argumentation, involving a sort of yin and yang of speaking and listening. So today I'm going to talk about my mentorship and how I became interested in argumentation, the evolution of my research, the relationship to complexity in arguments, and the relationship to complexity in educational change, and some of the implications for educational psychology as a field. So I would like to recognize my mentors at Stanford University who shaped me intellectually: Mary Bud Rowe, Jim Greeno, my chair Ed Hartle, Dick Snow, Robbie Case, and from Berkeley, Joe Campione. But they shaped me intellectually, but probably even more influential on my thinking were my high school teachers: Jim Minstrel, Mary Lindquist, Ruth Newman, Milt Yannix, Marion Boyer, Chip Wall, and Bob Mayer. Why? Because they introduced me and had me experience something that today we would call dialogic teaching. And it was very engaging, very thought-provoking. And they say you teach the way you were taught, and so I don't give a second thought at trying to teach dialogically or researching it as a subject matter. Okay, so let me describe a little bit about what I experienced at Mercer Island High School. So at the center of it was what we called the humanities block, a 3-hour block of time in which combined the study of Western philosophy with the great works of literature. And the week would start off with a lecture. We would have, twice a week, we'd have small seminar groups. Every few weeks we'd write a paper and present them to our tutorial group. So there's a lot of discourse, both oral and written. And the same model was followed in my junior year in the American Studies block. We had the math science block, and I also enrolled in a course taught by Jim Minstrel, his physics course. Now, as some of you may know, Jim was a pioneer in the use of dialogic teaching in science. And he was just earning when I had him as a teacher, he was just earning his PhD in science education from the University of Washington, and had received a national NSF grant with Mary Bud Rowe actually as the project officer at the time. So it was a grant to do high-level action research on how a teacher can change deep-seated physics misconceptions. So I'll never forget, one day he came into class with a little black tape recorder. Says, well, what's that all about? And then he had us diagram. He put a book on the table, and he had us diagram the forces acting on this book. And a rip-roaring discussion ensued. There were really two dominant views, two mental models that came to the fore. One was that gravity is one force on this book pulling it down, but it's not accelerating, so there must be some force pushing up, the force of the table. And other students say, no, that doesn't make any sense. The table's just there. It's not actively pushing. It's just in the way. Now, everyone had their hand up, and I couldn't get called on, so 40 years later, I'm going to tell you my piece. What I wanted to say that day was that the electrons in the book and in the table, they don't want to get too close to one another, so they're repelling one another, and so there is a force of the book on the table. I mean, on the table on the book. Well, both, actually. So that is sort of close to the normative conception, but Jim eventually tried to resolve this through a series of bridging analogies, and I won't go into detail what those are. My main point is how he was using dialogic argumentation in the classroom. He later wrote, it allows students to argue for the simplest explanation that explains the most phenomena. So years later, I was in graduate school, and I read an article on this very lesson that he had published in the physics teacher called Explaining the At-Rest Condition of an Object. And it apparently catapulted him to fame, and he developed a number of instructional innovations in the 80s and the 90s. But, I saw tapes of his teaching in graduate school, as well as tapes of other people and articles of other people conducting research and argumentation, including Deborah Ball, Maggie Lampert, having upper elementary school students, argue about the best way to add a fraction, or Ann Brown and Joe Campione doing research in environmental science and literacy using argumentation, and a number of other leading researchers. So I thought I'd get on the bandwagon and study this as part of my research program, and ever since I've tried to provide intellectual leadership in this growing subfield in education, the subfield of argumentation in education. And it has grown quite a bit. We now have our own SIG and early, and its argumentation has become part of all the national standards, etc. So that's how I became interested in argumentation. Now I'd like to define what I mean by argument and argumentation. So I define an argument as a claim supported by at least one or more reasons, and it may have some other components. But that's argument as a product, as a noun. We also use the word argument as a verb, as in having an argument. And that's just a dialogic process of constructing and critiquing arguments. Now, these arguments can either be adversarial, like a debate, you're trying to win and persuade the other parties, or at least the judge of your point of view, or it can be collaborative. And I define collaborative argumentation as individuals working together to construct and critique arguments. It's not a debate, but because participants can make concessions, change sides flexibly, and take in-between positions, which I'd say the discourse in Jim Minstrel's classroom was, at times it seemed adversarial, but ultimately it was collaborative because people were making concessions, they were changing sides. I mean, you'd have to if you wanted conceptual change. But I also experienced and observed another form of collaborative argumentation when I was collecting my dissertation data in two sixth grade classrooms in Oakland, in the inner city. The class was involved in a project to design a model city of the future. And there were, it was rich in discourse. So I wanted to examine how argumentation evolved in this alternative learning environment. So as part of my research design, I selected 8 target students, 4 introverts and 4 extroverts. I predicted they'd have different patterns of growth. So I followed them around, taped their natural classroom discourse, looked at their written discourse, and then at 5 different times during the course of the year, I would pull them out and put them in small discussion groups, the 4 introverts together or the 4 extroverts. And I'd have them discuss a controversial issue, and I would videotape it and transcribe it and all that sort of stuff. But I noticed they did have different argumentation styles. So the extroverts argued very adversarially. The introverts argued more collaboratively. So, for example, one topic of discussion was whether in this model city of the future they should have policemen, because some students argued, yeah, you need police for law and order, but other students said, well, the cops mostly are racist, and we don't want racist cops in our model city. So someone suggested, well, let's have robots as policemen. So let's look at some of their discourse. So Linda says, to build robots, I mean robots, or whatever they're called. I don't think it's all right, because they're going to watch us all the time. Cornelia, maybe they could build like, I don't know, maybe you could have something that would make the robots not watch you. Linda, like they could build something with the robot. Yeah, so it won't watch you all the time. And yeah, like Transformer, they could turn into a car, anything. And when you need help, you just drive there. You don't walk like this. Doom, doom. Or like every policeman. Every 2 policemen have a car, but it's really a robot. Yeah, and so when they need help, the car will transform into a robot. Yeah, and the inside comes out. What do you think about that idea? Oh, I think it's okay. Well, would you spend that much money to make a robot? No. Why? Well, you fix it, and then after that it broke, and you got no more money to fix it, and you're hungry. How are you going to do that? So what we see here is a dynamic, which I documented in their discourse, where one student would propose what I call a design claim. So a design claim is basically a design of a solution that mitigates the problems on one side of the issue. And so someone would make a creative design claim, and then other students would accept it or not, and maybe elaborate on it. And then someone else would propose a problem with it, a negative constraint, what about this or that? And that would lead to more design claiming. And in this process, the students were working together to construct and critique arguments, and basically to construct a solution to the problem. So I prefer collaborative argumentation over adversarial argumentation because the research has suggested you get more participation from introverts and other reluctant students, including those with less background knowledge. You also get deeper exploration of the problem space or idea space, and it's more, as I said, more facilitative of conceptual change. So why is it important to teach students to argue at all? Well, it's one lens or way of thinking of critical thinking, operationalized as the social discourse practices in a discipline like science or history or public policy. I mean, that's not quite a discipline, but they use a lot of argumentation in there. So, but argumentation can also be used as part of teaching content. It can promote, when it's done right, depth of processing and conceptual change. Makes students' thinking visible, especially students' prior conceptions. Students contrast alternative models, engage in critical evaluation. So here are some research citations of how argumentation, dialogic argumentation, can result in the development of general reasoning skills, and is also linked to deep subject matter understanding. However, here is a critical point. Arguments can be simple or complex. Now, simple arguments are easier to follow, but complex arguments provoke more of what we want, that depth of processing and perspective taking, and also are more true to the disciplinary practices in areas like science. So people like Clark Chinnon argue that scientists reason fairly complexly. So for these reasons, I have framed my research agenda over the years really on how to introduce complexity into students' arguments. Now, when I first started as an assistant professor at UNLV, I was researching, I noticed that students didn't really generate very complex arguments. So if you look at their online postings, they would usually agree with one another. Say, I agree, and sometimes they would elaborate, but they would rarely disagree or generate counter-arguments or rebuttals. So I framed my research question then as how can we promote and scaffold the generation of more counter-arguments and rebuttals being refutations of counter-arguments. So me and my colleagues, including Gail Sinatra and Caroline Kardas and Greg Schraw, we tried different things. One thing we tried were goal instructions, telling students to generate counter-arguments and rebuttals. Sometimes they had difficulty doing that if they didn't have enough background knowledge to generate the counter-arguments. So we would also, in other studies, gave dual positional texts where the arguments and counter-arguments were presented, and then we wanted to see if they could generate rebuttals on their own. And then note starters, where this is with online instruction, where there would be a menu of ways you could start an online note, including something like I disagree because so-and-so. And all of these were somewhat successful in increasing the number of counter-arguments and rebuttals. But there was still a problem that haunted me in that it doesn't say anything about the quality of the counter-arguments and rebuttals. All I was doing is counting their frequency, And some of them were, oh, that's a rebuttal, it's sort of weak, but I'm still going to count it. So for example, in one study using refutational text, the question was, should schools require students to wear school uniforms? And one claim was, yes, so students with poor-looking clothes will not be made fun of. Counter-argument is that might limit students' freedom of expression. But one rebuttal was, well, this criticism is just mumbo-jumbo. Those kids are going to be labeled as freaks and won't fit in. Well, I didn't feel that this was a particularly strong rebuttal. I didn't know to what degree these premises were true. But that was just my opinion. How can I show that formally? You would think philosophers would have worked this out by now, but that wasn't the case. Not in any way that could be operationalized reliably in a coding system. So I had to sort of work on this problem myself. I haven't solved it completely, but I made some intellectual advances that have helped, drawing on the work of 4 philosophers, Tolman, Walton, Bayes, and Pollock. So the Tolman model was only mildly useful, but it's the most used model in argumentation and education. So Tolman, his model, published his book, The Uses of Argument in 1958, held that arguments could have up to these 6 functional components. And some have argued, I'm not sure Tolman did, but some have argued that arguments with more of these components are stronger than arguments without them. So everything else being equal, an argument with backing is stronger than an argument without backing. But that has nothing to say about the quality of the backing or the strength of the content of any of these components. So it really suffered from the same problem I was trying to solve. So it wasn't particularly useful. Tolman just said that the standards for judging the strength of arguments, he just looked to disciplinary domain-specific standards for that. But another philosopher, Doug Walton, a Canadian philosopher, has argued that many of these standards are not domain-specific, but scheme-specific. So an argumentation scheme is a type of argument, and he's identified 60 or more of these schemes, and associated with each scheme is a set of critical questions that should be asked about whether the argument in question, and these questions help evaluate the argument. So, for example, examples of some of these schemes are argument from consequences, evidence to hypothesis, correlation to cause, arguments from expertise. So an argument from expertise is something's true if an expert says so. Well, a critical question is that expert really truly an expert on the topic at hand? And if the answer is yes, that strengthens the argument. And if the answer is no, that weakens the argument and is a basis for a counter-argument or rebuttal. Or for argument from consequences. So an argument from consequences is engaged in a particular course of action because it will lead to these positive consequences. So the critical questions are, how strong is the likelihood that these consequences will occur? What evidence supports these claims? And are there other consequences of the opposite value that should be taken into account? I've incorporated some of these into my scoring system, my coding systems. But then it occurred to me, well, why not teach students to ask these critical questions? And maybe we should be having students evaluate the strength and cogency of one another's arguments. And it turned out to be that I could do that more reliably, detecting whether they were asking critical questions or using the criteria and standards underneath each critical question. So I was thinking about I didn't really want to teach students, though, how to identify 60 different argumentation schemes in natural discourse. Some researchers have tried, but only up to 2 schemes. But I didn't want to get into scheme identification at all, so I really wanted to focus on the critical questions, because they're doing the analytic heavy lifting in trying to critique arguments. So since most of my topics related to the arguments from consequences scheme, I focused initially on just teaching students those questions. But the argument from consequences scheme isn't that applicable when I was working in science. There are a number of other schemes that are more applicable. So a different approach I have taken more recently with a philosopher, colleague of mine, Ian Dubb, was to identify 9 semi-general critical questions, because we noticed that a lot of the same critical questions were coming up a lot in the different argumentation schema. So these critical questions relate to the structural components of arguments, the quality of the evidence, the truth of the reasons, the use of accepted scientific principles, the coherence of the arguments, can you follow a path, alternative explanations or courses of action, completeness, does it account for everything it should, trade-offs, creative solutions, and the overall quality. So I've been working with about a half dozen middle school science teachers, and they took they went through a summer institute on argumentation, and then throughout the course of the school year, they had to design 3 lessons using argumentation and some of these critical questions. And some of the teachers incorporated, a couple of the questions, some incorporated all of them. The number varied, but they all reported that the critical questions did allow students to go deeper into the phenomena. So we're still analyzing the data, and I'll have more to say next year or the year after. But it does show that the critical question approach can be productive in getting students to engage in deeper processing and evaluation of arguments. Now, these are the actual questions, but I should have been showing that slide earlier. I'll give you a minute to read them over. But I want to turn to a third philosophic framework, the Bayesian framework, because critical questions in and of themselves, they don't quantify the strength of the argument. And so if you want some sort of quantification, you can use the Bayesian approach. I don't have time to talk about it now, so I'll just refer you to my 2011 EP article on the topic. But I do want to talk more in length about the fourth philosophic framework, one by John Pollock, who has defined strong arguments as a strong argument is one that is ultimately undefeated. So arguments can defeat other arguments, but those defeaters can be defeated. But ultimately, you might get an argument that he calls ultimately undefeated. And that's a strong argument, one that can withstand counter-arguments. And critical questions can start this dialectical process, but they don't necessarily complete it. So I thought his framework was a little too adversarial, not really in the spirit of collaborative argumentation. So I adapted it and came up with my own framework, the argument, counter-argument, integration framework, where I define an integrative argument, and this is important because I'm going to talk about integrative arguments for the rest of my speech. An integrative argument is one that addresses one or more counter-arguments. And under the theory that an integrative argument is stronger than a non-integrated one because it can withstand counter-arguments more, under Pollock's definition of a strong argument. So I'm going to use some examples from a study I did, a semester-long study in a 7th grade social studies classroom where they were discussing different current events. The topic was, should there be a carbon tax to decrease the use of fossil fuels? And some of the students were concerned about that because their parents don't like to pay taxes and they'd have less money for their kids. So a basic refutation of that would be saying the premises of that argument are not true, or that would somehow limit the scope of the argument. So, for example, a carbon tax won't reduce parental income really that much. But there are 2 other ways when an integrative argument can address a counter-argument. You can have these design claims I was talking about earlier, creative solutions that mitigate the problems on one side. So, for example, you use cars that don't use fossil fuels, and they came up with solar-powered cars and things of that nature. So, if their parents got those cars, they wouldn't have to pay the carbon tax. And then we're also weighing refutations. Weighing refutation is an argument that the values on one side are more important than the values on the other. So, for example, saving the planet is more important than holiday presents. Being a weighing refutation of the counter-argument that we'd have less money for holiday presents. Well, that's not as important as saving the planet. So, to support the argument, counter-argument integration process, to scaffold it, I came up with a graphic organizer known as the Argumentation V Diagram. And in this graphic organizer, the students, or sometimes the teacher, lists arguments on one side and counter-arguments on the other. And then students at the bottom of this V here have to compose an integrative argument that answers one of these 2 questions. Which side is stronger and why? Or is there a compromise or creative solution? And we typically have them fill out an AVD and then have them discuss it in a whole class or small group discussion, because according to Pollock, the critical questions should start a process of dialectic and dialogue in evaluating the arguments. And then they might fill the AVD out again in the middle or at the end of the discussion. But a problem emerged in that asking them which side is stronger, they didn't really have standards for deciding why one argument is stronger than another. So that's where I brought in the critical questions that I talked about earlier, and used what's called the critical question box that was inserted under the V. So they'd have to answer these questions before they wrote their final integrated paragraphs. And the questions related to the critical questions of argument from consequences, plus one relating to design claims and one relating to weighing refutations. So this is what a completed AVD looks like. This is the paper and pencil version with a critical question box filled out and with integrated paragraph. So we've, in various research studies, examined the effect of using the AVDs with the critical question box versus using the AVDs without it. And we've investigated the use of the AVDs at both the 7th grade level and the undergraduate level in both quick experiments, controlled experiments, or semester-long quasi-experiments, and have consistently found that students generated more integrated arguments, and therefore presumably stronger arguments, by using the critical question box. It has led to more refutations and practical design claims, and in both their discourse and in written paragraphs. And also, there is transfer to in-class essays or other writing situations where they didn't have recourse to using these AVDs, which suggests that they were internalizing or constructing some sort of argumentation schema that they could apply to new situations. And so to investigate the nature of these argumentation schema, as well as how they developed, I've done 2 microgenetic studies. One it's just been accepted to JEP, and the other was published in the Journal of the Learning Sciences. The second one, which is the first one actually, was about a student I call Guadalupe. And she is a student in this 7th grade classroom that was discussing current events. They were using AVDs in discussions, but first without the critical question box, and then I introduced the use of the critical question box. Before introduction of the critical questions, her reasoning was more one-sided, displayed a my-side bias, not considering counter-arguments. But the AVDs appeared to make her elaborate more on one side of the issue. Once the critical question box was introduced, then she started bringing in more considerations into her argumentation, usually asking questions that were somewhat akin to the critical questions. For example, are there other reasons for being homeless other than having dropped out of school? Or what are the costs? Where are we going to get the money? And then eventually it appeared that she was using a benefit-cost argumentation schema. So she was the one who came up with the argument. I think argument is stronger because global warming is more important than holiday presents. So her argumentation at the end displayed what communication scholars call integrative complexity, which involves a greater differentiation and integration of ideas than arguments and texts that are not as integratively complex. And it appeared developmentally that first the differentiation appeared and then eventually the integration. And now putting this in a developmental perspective, I was excited about because, these developmental theorists are always investigating the balance beam task. And, well, this is sort of like the same. Students are weighing benefits and costs, arguments and counter-arguments. So I use a neo-Piagetian framework from one of my mentors, Robbie Case, having to do with cognitive complexity. So in Case's theory, in working memory, we can entertain a simple schema, but sometimes we have to coordinate it with another schema causing cognitive load and complexity. But these schema are eventually integrated into a larger conceptual structure, causing simplicity, but then the process might be repeated. So for example, Case was studying a lot of mathematics, the mathematics domain. One of his examples that is that students, when they're learning about numbers, they may have a schema for counting, and they may have a schema for deciding which is greater, 4 or 3. But the two schema aren't integrated. Eventually, they'll become integrated and form a mental number line, which causes more cognitive simplicity, but then the student might have to consider another mental number line causing more complexity, usually one mental number line for the ones and one mental number line for the tens, etc. And so there would be this sort of yin and yang, this interplay between simplicity and complexity. And we see the same in argumentation. So if I'm having an argument, a dialogic argument with someone, I might start with a fairly simple argument. They may raise a counter-argument causing complexity, and then I may have a rebuttal of that causing even more complexity. But eventually, someone might just try to simplify things by generating an integrative argument. Basically what you're saying here is X, Y, and Z. So we have this alternation between simplicity and complexity. Programmatically, through the interventions I've developed, I've tried to make arguments more complex with critical questions and oral discussions, and using argument counter-argument integration moves like design claims. But also, I want students to end the dialogic process by making the complex simple, by generating closing integrative arguments that are strong because they address the strongest counter-arguments. So, for example, saving the planet is more important than other things would be an example of what I considered a strong integrative argument. So one metaphor we might think about is not just the yin-yang between simplicity and complexity, but that as we're developing argumentation schema and other mental representations, including a representation of the actual argumentation itself, is a spiral staircase where we go from simplicity to complexity, but upwards in creating more complex but integrated arguments. So I've described sort of the development of cognitive complexity, but of course there is also other forms of complexity, including motivational complexity. We have social complexity. There's a host of social processes going on when people are having a dialogic argument. One thing that I've studied in some detail is how students appropriate argumentation moves from other students. So like Guadalupe, many of the questions she was asking were similar to the questions her friend was asking, and she appeared to appropriate those argumentation moves. Dick Anderson has also looked at this in a lot of detail, but there are other social processes that other researchers have looked at, such as how participants ground their arguments. That means getting a shared referent, turn-taking, status, positioning, face-saving, and a host of other social processes that researchers and teachers really need to attend to. But talking about teachers, now there's another layer of complexity, instructional complexity, because these teachers, for example, who I've been working with, trying to design argumentation lessons, it's complex for them. They have to, first of all, attend to multiple conceptual components for whatever they're teaching. So, for example, in Minstrel's case, it was, there are forces pushing down as well as pulling up, or forces pushing up as well as pulling down. So they have to attend to these multiple conceptual components. They have to attend to multiple standards. They have to design activities and activity sequences that are engaging and informative and productive. They have to find good discussion questions. They have to find time to do collaborative argumentation when they have to cover a lot in the curriculum. They have to know how to manage the discourse in both small groups and whole class discussions, etc. And then there's even another layer of complexity for me and the researchers and teachers as well on how to change teaching practice. They have to develop and acquire a pedagogical content knowledge, not only about the content, but also about argumentation. And that requires a lot of teacher learning, which takes time. These teachers in my project wanted a second or third year of intense professional development. They felt that just having 1 year of this, they were just getting their feet wet, they were just trying things out, and learning some of the constraints involved. And they also wanted more models of expert teachers facilitating argumentative discussions, especially whole class discussions. All this required collective problem solving. They had to have monthly after-school meetings, or we did have after-school meetings and meetings with They met with a discourse coach, a more experienced teacher, or instructional coach who would come in and watch their target lessons and give them feedback. And all this also requires changes in teacher beliefs and boosting teacher confidence. So it's a long, complex process. But it's, again, an example of simplicity interacting with complexity. So if we think of learning dialogic teaching, if we take that as a case study, it's an example of educational change where we have to make the complex simple enough to master, but also the simple complex, so that the people involved are attending to multiple constraints and affordances. And this occurs in complex social systems where the system is changing also. So we have a lot of complexity, which brings me to complex systems. I want to sort of step back just from talking about argumentation for a moment and talking about the core construct in educational psychology, learning. So learning occurs in complex systems that involve learners, classrooms, schools, school systems. Those are all complex systems that use a host of interacting cognitive, motivational, instructional, and organizational variables. That in part explains the growing popularity in the last few decades of qualitative, mixed method, and design-based research to better understand that complexity. And more recently, we have dynamic systems research where you have multiple levels anywhere from the neurological level to the district level to the level of nation states and even worldviews. And each level constrains the level below it, but also the lower levels, you have emerging phenomena at the higher levels, often unpredictably. So I think talking now more as a field, educational psychologists do make arguments because argumentation is a central scientific practice. We do a lot of argumentation, for example, in the peer review process. But we have to realize we're making arguments about complex systems. And we want to make arguments also. We want to reach out and build bridges to practitioners and policymakers. And the rub there is that many of them want simple solutions. They want to arm teachers to prevent gun violence, or they want to teach the learning styles. And those are simple, and who can really blame them? They want to cut through the complexity and be able to control the environment, potentially. Of course, if they don't have evidence supporting what they're doing, it's no better than doing a rain dance to control nature. Or resorting to appeals to the supernatural. But that's a human tradition, because we are always trying to control our environment. I think as a field, we can respond to these with strong integrative arguments. So in the case of learning styles, for example, we often argue that there's not a lot of evidence for teaching the learning styles. And that argument, however, often falls on deaf ears. And we're always scratching our head. Why? One reason is that individuals might sense that there are individual differences in how people learn, but we have to point out those individual differences are complex and not easily captured by the construct of learning styles or teaching the learning styles. And the best thing for teachers to do is to use multiple modalities in their teaching so that whatever differences exist out there, they be catered to somehow. And also we can create multiple representations. But here I've made an integrative argument that responds to counter-arguments and presents a design claim on how to proceed. Or if we want to talk about preventing gun violence, well, arming teachers or having more armed guards can have a very negative effects on school climate. I'm drawing, of course, from our APA policy brief. But students are less likely to talk to adults and report on other students when they take guns and other weapons to school. And there's also likely to be more disgruntled students. Paradoxically, that might even increase the chance of school violence. So it's more effective to use a preventative public health approach where you're attending to school climate, you're targeting certain schools, and you're building local partnerships between schools and mental health and law enforcement and social service agencies and all these local partnerships. So it's a complex approach, and Avi can explain it a lot better than I can. But what we're doing is I'm giving an integrative argument, trying to make the complex simple and the simple complex. So I'm making a strong, relatively simple argument that can be understood while still conveying some of the complexities of the issue, that it is complex. And just to review what I mean by an integrative argument is one that addresses one or more counterarguments through a basic refutation or a design claim or a weighing refutation. So now we make arguments as educational psychologists, though not only about complex systems, we make arguments within complex systems. They may be academic systems, but we're trying to, those systems are loosely coupled also to the systems that policymakers and practitioners work in. And we could ask, within these systems, do strong integrative arguments make a difference, or will they still fall on deaf ears, particularly in political and school systems? And my answer to that is sometimes. I mean, these are complex systems, so sometimes small differences can make large effects and vice versa. But let's just, as an example, take the political realm and policy development. So, that's not what I want. Okay, so do arguments matter in public policy? So as Gail mentioned, I worked for 8 years for the California legislature, and I noticed that the thing that policymakers cared most about was getting reelected. But when they felt politically safe, they would listen to the arguments, and some would, the merits of the issue, and some would be swayed by arguments. So arguments do matter. And to give more academic backing from what I just said, according to Copland and O'Leary, arguments matter when positions are being developed, at the outset of the policy process, the stakes are declared, an agenda is set, and at the end of the process, when decisions are being made. Now, although arguments are a necessary ingredient to any strategy, they never work by themselves. The political conditions need to be right for arguments to be well received by a governing body, and you may need to craft a compromise based on political interests and power. Now, speaking about politics, in our present and actually our past political climate as well, it seems like adversarial, one-sided argumentation seems to be running rampant. And there are a number of reasons why. There are, of course, different stances, epistemic stances toward the truth. But there are also, actors are constantly pursuing many non-epistemic goals, such as money, power, status, or identity. Hugo Mercier and his colleagues have argued in a recent EP article, or 2016, that our cognitive machinery has evolved in political, tribal contexts, where there are opposing factions. So, of course, we've developed a my-side bias. We don't need to consider counter-arguments to our own position, because in these contexts, there would be an opposing faction that would bring counter-arguments up. So that accounts for the my-side bias, and the my-side bias is given as evidence for this position as well. But at the same time, Mercier and colleagues argue that in these contexts, sometimes we have to adjudicate between opposing sides and opposing arguments and opposing factions. And therefore, we've also developed a cognitive system that can consider other perspectives, that can evaluate arguments in a relatively non-partial fashion, that tries to figure out what's true, because people might be lying to further their agenda. So, sure, people may still need to learn from their culture standards for evaluating evidence or for asking critical questions, but we have this cognitive system for evaluating arguments somewhat impartially, and Pinker has tried to explain that this has led to the evolution of reason, rationality, science, technology, and ethics, and that we can make arguments to appeal to the better angels of our nature. So there is hope. So with that, I want to leave you with 4 calls to action. Here I'm making connections with the field of educational psychology. But here are 4 things I want everyone to work on. First of all, messaging, how to message your research to make the complex simple and the simple complex, and testing your message. So basically making an integrative argument that you could explain to your own mother or father. I mean, it's simple enough, but still conveying the complexity of what you're working on. Secondly, build at least one bridge. And these could be bridges between different opposing research approaches, quantitative or qualitative. They could be bridges between disciplines, like I've reached out to philosophy and created a collaboration with philosophers. I'm also trying to create collaborations with educational administrators who are one level above what I normally study. But they can be also bridges to practitioners or policymakers, creating research practice partnerships, as Nancy Perry and others have advocated for. So why is it important to build these bridges? Because we're studying a complex phenomena, and therefore we need complex approaches to understand what we're studying and to change it. So it's important to be bridge building. Third, be attentive to how much you listen, and listen more than you speak. Minstrel's mentor, Arnold Ahrens, told him, "You have 2 ears and only 1 mouth. Use them in that proportion." So he was talking about effective teaching and dialogic teaching, but we could apply the same maxim to personal relationships or leadership styles, or how we function in these local partnerships. Avi Kaplan and others have argued that in these situations we need to listen to what issues policy makers and practitioners are concerned with, and then do more research on those. But I would add, we also need to listen to understand the constraints and affordances and complexities that they're operating under. Listening also helps break down stereotypes. Humans have a tendency to think in stereotypes, and we have a tendency to think in stereotypes. That's true of all people, and academics are not excluded. For academics, we're constantly stereotyping other disciplines and fields like learning sciences. They're stereotyping us. I don't think that's healthy, because it's not conducive to bridge building, but also because thinking in stereotypes, you're not looking at the huge variation that may exist within a category. But the research has shown that interacting with others personally and listening to what they have to say, listening to their arguments before responding, is a great way of breaking down stereotypes and persuading people in other camps. So my fourth imperative or call is to engage in integrative argumentation, because all these things in one way or the other relate to argumentation. Messaging relates to integrative argumentation. Building bridges and listening relate to dialogic argumentation and collaborative argumentation. So it's a central scientific practice, so please engage in argumentation. And with that said, I'm going to put my hands in my pockets, and I've talked long enough, it's time to listen.